Hello, thank you for attending. I know it's late in the afternoon, so we'll get started. Work anywhere, managing effective remote engineering teams at Airbnb. Airbnb has many in-person traditions that focus on fun, celebration, and teamwork. As pictured here, this is a dance flash mob, which is curated by an employee, and we have other dance classes led by employees as well. Another example of an in-person tradition is what we call the human tunnel. New hires into Airbnb would run underneath this tunnel of colleagues cheering and screaming for them as they're welcomed into the company. However, such in-person traditions were put on hold when the pandemic struck. Airbnb closed all of its offices, remote work, and Zoom calls became the new norm. Even though we've moved on from the strict social distancing of the pandemic, remote work is still a core part of the software industry today. Airbnb has embraced a new remote-friendly policy. Previously, we were very in-person, and now we're allowed to work and live anywhere. Fun fact, all the photos that you'll see in this deck are going to be photos from Airbnb workplaces throughout the world. I'm here today to discuss Airbnb's experience with remote work and managing remote engineering teams. My name is Jessica. I use the pronoun she, her. I've been at Airbnb for over 8 years with experience on both product and infrastructure teams. Usually I give talks about scaling Airbnb's microservice architecture and migrations, but this year I wanted to try something different and give a talk about leadership. I've been in a management role for the past 3 years, and I currently manage our Viaduct team. Viaduct is a macro service. If you went to Randy's talk earlier today about minimal viable architecture, this is part of the optimization stage of that curve. Viaduct is a GraphQL service that supports almost all of Airbnb's traffic. It connects to thousands of downstream services as well as data stores. It has a GraphQL interface as its API layer. Currently, there are 13 engineers that are contributing to Viaduct on my team. And my team, as well as myself, have experience working across the world. Airbnb is based in San Francisco in Pacific time zone. I live in Austin, have worked in New York, Singapore, Hawaii in the past year. My direct reports have worked in various places such as Europe and in Asia. And I'm here this week with all of you in Australia. So this new distributed ways of working has been a change for Airbnb. That was a bit about me. Would like to know more about you all. So raise your hand if you work at a remote or hybrid company. Wow, okay, that makes sense why you're here at this talk. Raise your hand if your team spans more than one time zone. Okay, still relevant for you all? Okay, last question. Raise your hand if you find remote work to be challenging. Okay, for those of you who didn't raise your hand, you can leave the presentation. I'm just kidding. I raised my hand for all three. Remote work is more common to be offered as part of the software industry now. It's common, as all of you all raised your hands, for being distributed across different time zones, but it does present different challenges than an in-person work environment. I'll be discussing how a remote manager addresses some of these challenges and what their responsibilities are, and then dive into team norms. Team norms are aligned processes that the team has agreed upon to help streamline ways of working. Note for engineers, it's really important to have larger focus blocks to get high quality work done, so investments into making your team more efficient is really valuable. In addition to team norms, success and failure stories, I'll also share some stories around our culture and how, as a manager, you're in a position to intentionally set the culture. Finally, I'll conclude with what I think is next for the remote software industry. So starting with the remote responsibilities of a manager, I'd like to first focus on what an in-person manager is responsible for. An in-person manager is responsible for the team being impactful. This means the team is contributing towards business goals and objectives. An in-person manager is also responsible for the team being happy. This means that direct reports are engaged, growing, and feel connected to each other as well as to the company. Now, let's contrast this with what a remote manager is responsible for. The exact same things as an in-person manager. A remote manager is still responsible for the team being impactful and the team being happy. However, the techniques that a remote manager has available to them are a little bit different than what an in-person manager has. Both managers, however, can design a team to be impactful around creating team norms to improve developer productivity. As mentioned before, for engineers, it's really valuable to have that longer block of focus time to produce high-quality work. So a manager can really be helpful here by making sure that the team is efficient. For addressing team happiness, both managers are responsible for designing an intentional culture built upon trust, engagement, and recognition. Many studies have shown that the highest performing teams are built on a strong fabric of trust, and a manager is in a position to set this as an example. So both team norms and intentional culture are required to create an effective team. However, unfortunately, there's not one silver bullet that will work for all teams to address the challenges of norms and cultures. For example, I've managed 4 back-end infrastructure teams all within the same organization, and each of them had different preferences for what team norms and culture worked for them. As you heard in the keynote earlier today, iteration and feedback are really important, so it's valuable to continually solicit feedback from your team and adjust the norms and cultures along the way. Both norms and cultures are not static at all. I have a few ways that I get feedback from my team. One of them is using our company's engagement survey. This is something that is sent out annually, and it's a really good way to get data-driven results. Be able to compare your team's results against the previous years, as well as other teams and different parts of the organization. Within my teams, I run retrospectives quarterly, and this just has 3 simple questions. 1, what went well? 2, what did not go as well? And 3, what are things we want to change or improve? Every week, we have an on-call handoff meeting, as well as a team meeting, and this is another good way to solicit feedback. This is particularly important for different initiatives that we're trying to improve, meaning reduce, the on-call load for the team. And finally, I have weekly one-on-ones with each of my reports, which has been a really valuable way to get feedback on the new initiatives we're trying as well. Moving into some of these team norms, I've pulled out 3 examples: technical collaboration, intentional meetings, and time zone etiquette. Starting with technical collaboration, there are many challenges that are present with technical collaboration that weren't as noticeable in the in-person world. For us, Airbnb has a complex architecture, and thus diagramming is more complicated as well. Before the pandemic, we were very much an in-person collaboration environment, but now, with the remote setting, we needed to go to asynchronous or digital forms of collaboration, and digital whiteboarding was not something that had landed well at Airbnb. Due to less opportunities to have spontaneous conversations with peers, this led to less organic knowledge sharing, and also reduced cross-team exposure. Within a team, peers weren't as familiar with what each other were working on, and across different teams, people also didn't know what they were working on, We were missing a lot of that from our in-person days. So I'm going to focus on one way of asynchronously collaborating through design docs. We did have some initial challenges here from our first approach. As an attempt to be more design doc heavy to address the async collaboration, we created team message channels focused on design docs. We had one for our build designs, we had one for our deploy designs, we had one for our on-call process designs, and people would drop in various documents on these channels. However, the team gave feedback that it was really hard to find out what needed to be reviewed, what was the status of each document, which channel needed to be looked at, what were the priority orders of these various documents. So one of the team members suggested a RFC, or request for comments process. RFCs have been really useful for us, and Viaduct is a very architecture and senior heavy team. We are undergoing Viaduct 2.0, if you will, and re-architecting this to be able to scale to the next 1,000 developers. However, before going into what we do, I'd like to discuss why, because I do think having an organized design doc system for your team is important, whether it be RFCs or a different team norm. Having organized asynchronous collaboration improves the efficiency of the way your team collaborates. It also improves cross-team visibility. It's really easy for us to point other teams into what we're working on because we have a really simple, organized system. For the various new team members who joined, where their onboarding was all remote, having this system has also been really helpful for them to find the paper trail of past decisions that were made, context, and what the team is working on now. And finally, another benefit that was a pleasant surprise to me is when I do cell calls with candidates, I'm able to show them how we do our asynchronous collaboration within the team, and they're really drawn to the technical rigor and architecture design processes within this team. So this process has been really helpful for recruiting new members as well. Okay, back to what we do for RFCs. In a single sentence, RFCs are a set of peer-reviewed documents that are sequentially numbered in a single folder. Let me make this a little bit more concrete. Here's what it looks like for us. We have this one public folder for Viaduct RFCs. Anyone in the company has access to view this folder. There are two subfolders, one being our drafts folder. Anything in here are documents that are ready for review or currently going on iterations for review. The other subfolder, what we call historical, these are documents that we made before we introduced the RFC process, but they still provide really valuable paper trails, discussion, and serves as artifacts for the Viaduct architecture and design. So what makes something an RFC, besides being in this magical folder, is having a simple header. We experimented with a few different ways of this, and having something that was as lightweight as possible had the best adoption within the team. The header has the name of the document, the reference number to it, the date it was published, authors, and status. For the status, we only have two options. It's either a draft in that draft folder or published, which is in this outer folder. Published means that it's been approved by peers, all the comments are resolved, and it's ready to be an artifact of the Viaduct architecture. Moving on, you can see that each of our published RFCs has a sequential number. These are incremented based upon the published date, and it's a really easy way for us to reference different documents by using the RFC number. If there is a change to an RFC that is published, we publish those amendments as a new RFC. So for example, the Viaduct team had a 12 to 18-month strategy as ways to scale our build and deploys. However, upon starting some of the build work, we realized that our initial assumptions weren't exactly true, so we went back and revisited some of the trade-off debates that we had before, made updates, and published that as a new RFC. As mentioned earlier, having a paper trail is really important. So when there's long common threads in an RFC, instead of just resolving them and have them disappear, they get summarized and put in the appendix so future readers are able to see what was discussed and how certain decisions came about. And finally, the last process to our RFCs is creating an index document. Our index document has references to all the active projects that the team are working on this quarter. So anyone from around the company is able to quickly go to this document, see the projects we're working on, and be able to find out more information about these. I'd like to stress that RFCs are not specific to being a really architecture-heavy team. And the takeaway here is to have organization for your design docs, as remote work does lean more heavily on asynchronous collaboration. But not all work can be done asynchronously. Meetings still are incredibly valuable. They allow people to build ideas off of each other, build relationships. But they do have challenges in a remote world. There is communication and scheduling overhead with creating meetings. It's often possible for someone to get too many meetings and feel meeting overload and fatigue. This can lead to disengagement as well as burnout. So some principles of meetings that we try to abide by are as follows, and I want to stress that these are also valuable principles for in-person meetings as well. However, because the toll of remote meetings is higher, being extra judicious about these principles has great payoff. The first principle is defining the purpose of the meeting very clearly in the invite ahead of time. Is this a decision-making meeting? Is this soliciting feedback? Is this knowledge sharing? This enables the recipient to decide if it's valuable for them to be attending this meeting live. Are they able to get the same information from a recording, or just catch up on the notes later? In addition to setting the purpose of the meeting, having a clear agenda in the beginning allows for asynchronous preparation to happen. In all of my meetings, we have a note taker assigned as well to create live notes and publish them as documentation of the discussion that happened in the meeting. And finally, the last principle is try to minimize the number of attendees that you have in your meetings to only those that are directly relevant participants. For us in person, there were some physical constraints that made this a little bit easier. Meeting rooms had very little availability, and there were only so many chairs in the meeting, so you could not keep inviting a ton of people. However, with video calls, it's really easy to just add another person on to the invite. So before you do that, really think about, is this meeting valuable for this person to be synchronously present, or is there a way that they can get this information afterwards? Some ideas that we had around meetings that did adhere to these principles was this open agenda drop-in meeting for our marginalized gender and tech group. There was an agenda, but the agenda was just very wide. You could come in to get feedback on your presentation, you could come in to find a mentor, you can come in for social reasons. All the attendees were optional, but because it was unclear what the meeting was going to be on any given day, there was very low attendance. Another meeting that I was super excited to try, since I get a lot of meetings as a manager, was ending them 5 minutes early. Sounded like a good idea to reduce on the meeting fatigue to have a little break, but meetings ended up going to the full duration of the 30 or 60-minute mark. Next on my list to try is starting the meetings 5 minutes late in order to get that break. Another set of series of iterations we've done is our status updates meetings. In person, we had daily stand-ups. It was partly social and fun, and those just carried over to be video call meetings daily. However, through team feedbacks, one-on-one, and my own personal preference, this is way too many meetings to have a week just on status updates. So we changed it to be a synchronous process, just putting a Slack update daily in our message thread. This worked okay, but then we slowly found that I was mostly pinging people to put their updates in, so we decided to try this on a weekly cadence only. Every Friday, put in your update of the things you did that week. This worked well for a few months, but again, participation started slowing down, and I didn't find it as useful, the team didn't find it as useful, so we got together and figured out, like, what would we want this to be? And as we reminisced upon the stand-up from in-person, that social element and be able to discuss what each other was working on was important. So now our latest version is we have a bi-weekly video call meeting dedicated to status updates and planning. Through various feedback methods, such as bringing this up when we discuss the company-wide engagement survey and our quarterly retrospectives, we continue to revisit the efficacy of this particular meeting, because why have the meeting if it's not important to anybody? And here's how this fits in my team's recurring meeting calendar. You'll see on Mondays, we have our on-call handoff, team weekly, and then every other week we have that live sprint review. On Wednesdays, we have a technical brainstorm for the whole team. And Friday, we have a social half hour, just a small segment. Every week, I meet with my direct reports, and we hold retrospectives quarterly, as well as all hands quarterly. Now I'm going to focus on two of these meetings, the tech brainstorm and the retrospective. And the first thing I'm going to call out is that we do have an hour-and-a-half weekly meeting to brainstorm with the whole team. So I just spent a long time saying meetings are expensive, they cause toll on each person, so why have this really long, frequent technical brainstorm meeting? Viaduct is an architecture-heavy team, so there are tons of design docs and decisions that we are making to plan on a multi-year vision. However, even if your team is not super architecture or senior leaning, having a combined technical brainstorm does have benefits. It's a single meeting to schedule, so this is a lot easier than having multiple ad hoc meetings throughout the week. And because it's a single meeting, having fewer meetings means less context switching for the engineers. As mentioned before, giving them as much long focus time has great payoff. For us, having this longer meeting gives flexibility for more in-depth discussions in longer duration. And here's what our technical brainstorm iteration looked like. At first, we had our sprint planning meeting combined with this design meeting. And then the team gave feedback and in one-on-ones that there wasn't actually enough time to talk about the designs. We pulled this out into a separate dedicated design meeting and had it set ambitiously at 90 minutes. The intent was if we didn't fill up that 90 minutes every week, we could shorten it. We found that the design meetings were taking up the full 90 minutes, but in one-on-ones, people were giving feedback that it wasn't useful for them all the time. I then tried to create time slots in the agenda, scheduling each of the talks that were scheduled for that week for 15 or 30 minutes at a time, and setting attendance to be optional. However, this is a little bit more idealistic and did lose some of the benefits of having that flexible, longer meeting. So from team feedback, we decided to create a priority ordered list of all the topics that were going to be discussed that week, and I would facilitate them to make sure that the important ones were covered, and those that can be done the next week were just moved over. This is an expensive meeting, so we do revisit this frequently in retrospectives and one-on-ones, as well as more casually in the team meetings to make sure that it's an important and valuable use of everyone's time. Here's what our agenda looks like for this meeting. One of the principles of good meetings is having a very clear agenda, and we use this board to describe what we're going to talk about. On the far side, we have a backlog section. These are ideas that someone thinks would be worth writing a more detailed design document or having a more detailed discussion about. Then the second column combines with the RFC process. These are things that have RFCs that are ready for review or discussions kind of on the docket for next week. The next column is upcoming scheduled. So this is the agenda for the upcoming Wednesday. They're listed in priority order, and if there's a specific date that they need to be discussed or decision needs to be put by, it's put directly on the task. You'll notice that there are some tags in here, one saying live and brainstorm meeting. This means a discussion is being requested. Other types of talks can be knowledge sharing or demos. And then at the bottom, you'll see for the integration of online data stores, it has an offline only tag. This person made an RFC, wanted to get reviewed, and had a date in which they need certain decisions by, but it wasn't something that was discussed live. I take notes during our meeting and put them all in the tasks, as well as tagging people in action items, and we have a running list of discussions that were completed. Because it's an expensive meeting, though, I mentioned we get feedback regularly, and one way is to get it in retrospectives. I'd like to talk about how to run a remote retrospective, and something that I'm super excited about is digital sticky boards. There's not many things in the remote world that I prefer over in person, but sticky boards is one of them, so let me go through my list of why I love them. One is that it's a lot easier to read your peers' notes when they're typed out instead of reading their handwriting. Have you ever been in the back of the room trying to squint? What did that person write? You don't have that problem anymore with a digital sticky board. And because you're typing, you're able to add more detailed responses. And as a manager, I'm doing a lot of facilitation of grouping the responses together. It's a lot easier for me to organize this on the digital sticky board than in person. There's increased engagement. People are able to add to the board in parallel. And it's also more anonymous, so you get some feedback that maybe someone might not have felt comfortable with if they had to physically go put it on the board themselves. Finally, it's a lot easier to save a digital sticky board and revisit it or even add to it later than a physical one. So if you don't use digital sticky boards, I hope I've convinced you now. Here's an example of one that we did looking back at our Q3. This is the what went well section. And you'll notice here, it has a lot of engagement. As a manager, I start the retrospective by putting out some of the things that we've tried in this past quarter as reminders of things for people to give feedback on. I also contribute a bit of the notes, but I really want it to be driven by the team. My responsibility is to make sure that people are engaged, that certain topics are getting covered, and creating themes so that people are able to easily build off of each other's ideas. For Q3, I was super happy to see that without my prompting, RFCs, brainstorms, and onboarding were all called out as areas of things that went well. So this is great to have positive feedback for some of the initiatives that we've been trying. Obviously, in the what didn't go well, there's feedbacks of things that we can be improving, and we're working on that now in Q4. And finally, the last example I'll pull out for team norms is focus on time zone etiquette. It's really important to be transparent about your time zone if you want people to respect it. You can start by adding your working hours on your calendar. And what I find helpful is blocking this if need be hour section off. Most of my team is still in San Francisco, and in Austin I'm 2 hours ahead. So I block off my evening so people are aware to not schedule meetings then, but if something is really urgent, it is available so they can ask. When people are working more worldwide, we have an understanding as a team to be available during about 4 core hours that overlap with the majority of the team and to attend all the existing team meetings. So this is regardless of time zone. And finally, a good way to be respectful of time zone is to have direct message expectations within the team. I've had teams where they prefer to have direct messages at any given hour, but you're not expected to respond if it's after hours. And I've had teams where they've preferred to not send any direct messages after hours and to send them the next day. Some ideas working for us now. Again, being transparent. We have in various profiles throughout the company of what the local time of each employee is. I make use of scheduled messages and emails heavily to make sure that my messages are sent during the recipient's working hours. Also, if you send it right as the first thing in their morning, they're more likely to respond to you, so there's added benefit there. Also, making use of snoozing notifications during off hours helps to separate your work-life situation, even if you're working at home. And finally, an area that we just tried in Q3 is personal priorities. A bit more about those. Personal priorities are an area that allows you to share with your team things that are important to you outside of what you do at work. Each of the members has a slide that we share with the team. You put a few things that are important to you in your outside of work life. You can share some photos if you want. So for me, I have a dog. I like to do workout classes. And the part that puts it into action is blocking this off on your calendar and be very transparent about that. So my workout classes or dance classes are often in my evenings, which are in Pacific time afternoon. I just put it directly on the calendar, decline meetings. People don't schedule things during them. And this has been helpful for many others on the team, including parents. If you need to take care of your children during certain hours, pick them up during certain hours, putting it directly on the calendar and have your peers be aware of that has been a good way so that you don't need to decide between your work and out-of-work priorities. So given all of that, imagine you did everything there and you set the perfect team norms. All of your meetings ended on time with a decision. Engineers in different time zones were super productive and happy. Still only half the equation of managing an effective team. You must still foster an intentional team culture. And the key word here is intentional, not letting it happen organically, being thoughtful about how you want to shape your team culture. And as a manager, this is a lot of your responsibility as the lead of the team. But first, back to you again. Raise your hand if you've ever tried a team virtual happy hour. Okay, a lot of happy people, hopefully. But now, keep your hand raised, or I guess I haven't put the hand down. Maybe this is the answer already. Keep your hand raised if your virtual happy hour still has high attendance. Okay. I was like, if someone says yes, I'm going to ask them for how they did it. Yeah, my hand goes down as well. It's really hard to keep good ideas working. So things that were great in person or things that were great in the remote work life, they lose momentum. People get tired doing the same thing over and over. Some ideas for us is that in the beginning we had all-hands sessions. There was a breakout feature on Zoom and people were really excited to use it. But now when the word breakout is mentioned at an all-hands, people start leaving the meeting. They do not want to participate. Another idea that was great in the beginning was these weekly online games. The Viaduct team would spend an hour every Friday playing games together, and they missed each other in the beginning. But slowly as the months went by, years went by, this became lower in attendance. It turned to every other week, and now it's just a half hour. We just chit-chat casually. We don't play games and host it. So I would like to acknowledge that a connected culture is harder to form in a remote-first environment. And our engagement survey data just came out. Connection to community and connection to other people in the company were amongst the lowest scoring. So it is a really difficult thing to get right. So I would like to share some ideas that are working for us now and that I'm continuing to iterate on. Certain pillars include trust and connection, engagement, and recognition and appreciation. So moving on to building trust and connection. As mentioned before, high-performing teams have a strong fabric of trust. And a way to do this is to have people know a little bit about each other as humans. For questions of the week, I've done different approaches depending on the size of the team that I'm managing. For smaller teams, we've had dedicated sessions where people would ask a question and we'd all change our Zoom background, like this one. It's where would you like to hide out for a week? It's really high participation. Found that as the group gets larger, though, waiting for everyone to talk for 5 minutes means it's an hour-long meeting. So we shorten this into just a question or just a photo. And for even larger groups, like the size of viaduct team is now, we had A or B lightning questions. Everyone just answered, are you a morning person or an evening person? And as described earlier, things that worked out well in the beginning, like the question of the day, our lightning questions here would rotate who was asking. They lose momentum, so team feedback, people are getting tired of doing the same thing, so we tried doing photo of the day. So now people just share a fun photo, or it could be a boring photo, it could be a photo of their desk at the moment, of something that happened in the past week, and we just chat about it for a few minutes. Working at Airbnb, of course, we do Airbnb experiences, and there are online experiences. I found that the ones that have more active collaboration and puzzle solving have had the highest engagement with our teams. So for us, solving a murder mystery or doing escape the rooms virtually, even though it is virtual, have gotten excitement, and people have asked, when are we doing the next one? Another area that has had really good reception within the team is the Show and Tell series. Each team member has a dedicated 30 minutes to talk about themselves, and because talking about yourselves is a pretty wide topic, we've had a few iterations of this where one, everyone is talking about a travel story, or a second iteration, everyone is talking about a favorite hobby. One of the teammates here is talking about his trip to Alaska. As a manager, I always go first for these, just so people get to know me on a more personal level, and to kind of see like things that are okay to share at work. And people really like these and can't wait to hear the next travel one, especially because Airbnb's really into travel, so people have a lot of cool travel recommendations. Switching on into more engagement, remote engagement is definitely more difficult. You get far less body language signal when you're just looking at someone from their webcam view. Only a single person can talk at a time in a meeting. There are far more environmental distractions. I've definitely had my dog bark when someone rang the doorbell. And multitasking is very tempting, guilty of that as well. Some ways that we try to combat this include having a stronger video on culture. And as a leader, either manager or tech lead of the team, the rest of the team will tend to mimic your behavior. If your video is on, their video is on. If yours is off, the whole team's is off. You're able to get a lot more information about what's resonating, what's not, if someone's trying to talk but can't get a word in when the video is on. So about people talking, as a manager, it's important to facilitate ideas and participation from everyone. This could be actively monitoring the chat, looking if someone is muting, unmuting, muting, unmuting, but not able to speak at the right time, calling on folks, and also be able to incorporate ways to asynchronously participate as well. For distractions that may appear in a remote work environment, at Airbnb, we're really transparent when those distractions are in the room, seeing people's kids come in, their dogs, just being very open about if something is taking away your attention, you go deal with it and you can come back and be present. For multitasking, this is a hard one. Video on does help a bit, focusing on creating effective meetings such that people don't feel the need to multitask does help a bit, but also getting and giving feedback when multitasking is happening. You're seeing someone's multitasking a lot, figuring out what about the meeting is not being important to them, or also that it's really obvious that you're multitasking. You might want to be a little more intentional. The final area around culture that a manager is really responsible is creating a culture around recognition and appreciation. Especially in a remote environment, making sure that people feel recognized for their work when they're not able to work together in person is important. You may have heard the phrase, praise in public, criticize in private. And as a manager, you have the ability to be that example. If you're catching people doing something right, other people will do the same. I'm going to focus on ways to publicly appreciate others. The first way that I use is in our team meetings. Here's like in a template for our agenda. We do our flow of the day, and then we jump immediately into appreciations. As a manager, I think it's really important to also participate in these appreciations. And areas that I try to explicitly call out are the different glue work activities that I see the team doing. So by glue work, I mean things that are required to keep the technical foundation running. That might not be the most glamorous. Could be cleaning up tech debt. Work that it's not necessarily moving a big business goal or a launch, but is needed for the team health. Airbnb has built an internal tool focused on appreciation and has created visibility around that as well. Any employee is able to send appreciation to any other employee at the company, and then this gets posted on our employees' profiles, is looked at performance reviews, and an email gets sent to their manager. So it's a good way to have others be able to appreciate others and let their managers know. Finally, the last example I'll give is around public nominations and awards. From our company engagement survey, one of the feedback themes that came back was that technical debt and foundation weren't appreciated. All this migration work was needed, but it wasn't treated the same as a cool product launch. So leadership heard this and created our Tech Excellence Award. Both ICs and managers can nominate anyone who has been really instrumental in building out the tech foundation, modernizing our tech stack, or just taking on a lot of tech debt and migration work. And this has been a great way for various projects to be highlighted that were not before. So nearing the end, what do I think is next for remote software engineering? Well, in all the retrospectives I've had around team norms and intentional culture, each one of my teams have asked me, pregnant pause, so when can we meet up again in person? This always comes up as a long discussion about it, and there's clearly a desire for people to be working together in person. I did organize an optional in-person offsite this year, which was really successful in fostering trust and teamwork. It was particularly helpful for people who hadn't met their peers in person before and for new hires to the company. Here we're doing just a fun street art class where they taught us how to spray paint graffiti on the walls. And the in-person collaboration is not something that necessarily needs to be digging into the deepest technical details of the company, but just really getting to know each other as people. Thus, my prediction for remote work is that in-person elements are still going to be really important to be incorporated. There's nothing that can completely replace the benefits of in-person collaboration, so I do think that there will be at least a little bit of that in remote work. So, things to leave here with. As a leader for the team, designing processes focusing on team impact and happiness, creating structured norms for your team to collaborate, create effective meetings, and be very mindful of each other's time zones, investing heavily in intentional culture. Instead of letting it happen organically or passively, really think about how to stitch your team together. And finally, start thinking about how to incorporate an in-person element for people to connect. It's important to solicit feedback to shape these team norms and culture as they continue to change. People get tired. What works now might not work in 6 months. So having that feedback loop is really valuable. And I don't know what's going to work for everyone. Don't know what's going to work for my team in 6 months, but we've learned a lot from remote work in the past few years. If you have good ideas, please share them, because we all are iterating and improving on managing effective remote engineering teams. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Jess. We have about 5 minutes left. Hands up if you'd like questions, and I'll come around with the mic. Thank you, coming over.
Just wondering, how do you promote engagement and for those shy or more reserved team members to still collaborate when working remotely in meetings especially?
Yes, definitely. I had experience with some of those folks who didn't prefer to talk live in meetings, who would sometimes put in the chat, or I've had some team members who are really vocal and kind of take up a lot of space in the meeting. So I've had kind of a two-pronged approach. One, talking to the folks who take up more space and say, like, hey, you have really valuable ideas. Can you help me grow the rest of the team by giving them more space? And some of them didn't realize they were talking a lot. So like hearing them, they're like, oh yeah, I didn't mean to do that. And having them kind of like be on my team to engage other folks has been a good way, instead of just me picking on people. Other folks on the team are supporting their teammates. So framing it as a way to grow the teammates has been good. And then talking to the people that are more quiet and being like, hey, I notice you're not engaged this way. Are there other ways that you prefer to participate in? And then say, like, I've talked to some of your teammates and they're really excited to hear more of what you have to say and that you're a valuable member of the team. So talking to both parties has been effective.
Thank you. Anyone else with a question? Yeah.
What are some strategies for your developers to be able to sort of pair in different time zones? You mentioned like a 4-hour time that they could use, but like, do you make sure that time doesn't have any meetings or anything for your developers, or how do you get around that?
For those who are we're US based, not on the US time zone, say they're working in India, most of their teammate is in San Francisco, them being very explicit of having the same set of hours every day that the person is available has made it easier for both people, for the teammates to know when they can schedule when that person, so putting that directly as blocks on the calendar available for meetings during this time. Does require a little bit of off-hour work for those who are in the US in our case, hours. So for example, when I was in Singapore, I just worked Pacific hours. It was a lot easier to not change all the meetings around, and we don't have people right now that are permanently located outside the US, but I do think that norm will change. When we collaborate with teams in India or China, it's usually like 1 or 2 hours earlier than their normal workday and 1 or 2 hours later than our normal workday, on which we'll schedule meetings. So we'll do like a 7 p.m. that'll match with their 8 or 9 a.m.
Thank you. Were there any other questions? Wonderful.
There is a team meeting that happens every Monday that you mentioned. What is that, a status update kind of a meeting?
Well, every other Monday is the status update. The team meeting, honestly, from my perspective, is just for the team to be together and to chat. That's part of it. There's team, like the appreciations, acknowledgements, my announcements, but it's really a time to get feedback from the team of what's working well, and then every other week we go through our more judicious Asana board that has all the tasks and plan what people are going to do for the next 2 weeks.
All right, on my way.
Thanks for your talk. I guess the focus has been on your team specifically, how does the company manage everything outside of your team? Because I think one of the challenges with remote work is it's quite hard to build connections and engagement across teams, but then that can become a burden as well because you have all these extra, meetings on top of everything else, and you're trying to block out time to free up your team. Well, free up time for your team, but then other meetings get dumped in, related to company-wide stuff or another team that wants to do something, or, your unit within the company has regular meetings. How do you sort of tackle some of those challenges while keeping a balance, I guess?
Yeah, that's a good question. Things that work well for my team, I actually bubble out to sister teams in the org and see some adoption there, so we're more consistent, but kind of try them on my team and only share out the good ones. And then I also strongly encourage the team to be declining meetings, not just accepting everything that comes away or suggesting other options. And I will sometimes calendar stalk people that I know are a little bit too nice and remind them hey, you don't need to be taking this meeting at 8 p.m. because you're in Eastern time. Please tell them to schedule it during a time where it's during your working hours. So having our team be more rigid about protecting their time, other teams have kind of got the hint of what we're trying to do, but it's definitely harder, and having more unified processes across the greater org, I think, will help. So I try to incubate ideas and then I share with the other managers.